Om, Om Gurubhyo Namaha. Welcome to our Global Hindu Federation webinar. My name is Pandit Sharma, and I'm going to be your host for a few minutes. We have a colleague who is going to be joining us shortly. She's normally our host, but has experienced a few technical issues. But keen to get everything underway and to make most use of the time everybody has very generously afforded to us. So today we're going to be tackling a complex but very contemporary topic. On the one hand, we, the British Hindu community and the global diaspora, are very aware of our contributions to the state of the world. The diaspora has been very active. India has been contributing resources, including manpower, including intellectual power, and including foot soldiers for a long period of time, ever since the British were in occupation in Bharat. And on the other hand, we're seeing a rising tide of anti-Hindu sentiment. Despite the community's reputation as a model minority and the contributions I mentioned, we are still seeing increasing amounts of rhetoric. We're seeing remarks which are clearly anti-Hindu, and many similar incidents are arising on a pretty much daily basis across the globe. So as I was researching this, I came across our guest today, who's going to be talking to you in more detail. He has done a lot of research on the subject of the specific participation of the Indian foot soldiers, the Indian resources, and the relationship between Great Britain and India at the time of the First and Second World Wars. This is a history which is not very often shared. It certainly could do with a lot more airing in the United Kingdom. And so we thought we'll start a small process to publicize a campaign which our guest today has been working on, and he'll be telling you more about it in a moment. So my guest is Shri Kumar Bala. He has a professional alter ego. He's a technocrat and a very successful entrepreneur. But with regard to the work that we're doing today, he is a researcher and an author and has spent many years conducting research in this particular space. Balaji, welcome to our webinar. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the fruits of your research and to share with you that I've derived a great deal of understanding and indeed delight at the facts that you have unearthed. So welcome to the GHF webinar on Mission Marigold. Balaji, I think you're automatically, yes, if you could, that'd be great. Welcome to the show.
Namaskar, Panditji, and thank you all, Dhanyawad, for joining this call today to talk about this very important and timely campaign to recognize the contributions of the Indian soldiers. So, to begin with, the Indian soldiers have been a major part of the British Army for the last 200 or 250 years. Interestingly, it was Enoch Powell who noted that the British Empire should technically be called as the Anglo-Indian Empire because of the amount of Indian influence, both in terms of the manpower and in terms of the financial backing that went into the creation of the British Empire, right? So, starting from the beginning, majority of the fighting forces of the British Army in the subcontinent and in North Africa and Mesopotamia has always been Indian. So you would generally have something around 60 to 70% of the fighting troops of Indian origin, about 20 to 30 of European origin, which could be the English, the French, and the Dutch. In expanding the empire across the world. So this is why Enoch Powell, in his famous speech after the River of Blood speech, mentioned that it should technically be called an Anglo-Indian Empire because of the influence of the people of India in building this empire. Right? So I'm sorry, go ahead, Panditji.
Yeah, it's a story which really does need to be told. I mean, even the notion that Enoch Powell, who the world views as a terrible racist, and the rhetoric around him has been created to really paint him in a very dark light. But I have studied his speeches, and to some degree, now that we're seeing Great Britain become aware of its own indigeneity, I can actually understand where he came from. And what you mentioned about people not knowing the extent to which the Indian forces were represented across the globe. I recall traveling in Haifa, and in Haifa coming across a monument uh, to the Indian soldiers and their contribution in defending Israel. So I'm fully aware of the extent of knowledge that we need to start to share. Before you just jump into the detail, which I'm going to ask you to go into, can you just briefly outline Mission Marigold? And then we can go into the details to support it. I think that'd be really helpful.
Yep, a Mission Marigold is a community-led initiative to recognize the contributions of nearly 4 million Indian soldiers who fought in the First and the Second World War as part of the Allied forces, right? So this mission is a ground level, bottom-up initiative to get more people participating in Remembrance and Armistice and Veterans Day event across the globe. So you have the Remembrance Sunday and Remembrance Day in the United Kingdom, you have the Veterans Day in the United States, and you have the Armistice Day in Europe. So the main aim of this initiative is twofold. One, get the Indian diaspora aware of the contributions of the Indian soldiers in freeing the world. Number two, get the recognition for the Indian soldiers who fought valorously for freeing Europe and the wider West. Most often than not, in the conversation about the two world wars, it is Americans who are portrayed as the heroes who came in at the last minute and freed the world. But in reality, it is the Indian soldier who, from day one, was part of the Allied forces. And at some point in 1940s, one out of every three soldier fighting in the Second World War as part of the Allied force was Indian. That's how significant the Indian contribution was. Americans decided to join the battle, join the wars later in the day. But Indians have been part of this global conflict from day one onwards. And Indians also have another speciality or something that's unique to them in the fact that while the Americans and to a large extent the Russians fought to free the white European nations, Indians not only fought to free the white European nations, but also fought to free the North Africans, the Mesopotamians, and the Southeast Asians, and of course, Bharat on its own. So today, world is free, and and one of the main reasons for why the world is free is because of the contributions of the millions of the Indian soldiers who fought valorously in the First and the Second World War, right? So this story is never told. And I think there is a reason why that was the case, and we'll delve into it through this conversation as to why that happened and how do we correct this injustice, right? So so Mission Marigold is an attempt in correcting this injustice, in bringing to light the contributions of the Indian soldiers in both the world wars. And Banditji,
Um,
just one point
mm,
about Haifa. You mentioned Haifa in Israel commemorating the Indian soldiers who fought in the Battle of Haifa. But interestingly, the British Mandate of Palestine, which would effectively become the state of Israel, was only possible because of the Jodhpur, Mysore, and the Baginagar Lancers who defeated the Ottomans and the Germans in the Eastern Mediterranean. If the Indian Lancers haven't defeated the Ottoman gunners and the German boats in the Eastern Mediterranean, there wouldn't have been a British Mandate of Palestine. It would still remained under the Ottoman occupation, and we would not have the modern state of Israel. That is why Israel every year celebrates Haifa Day, and Dalpat Singh, uh, um, the major who led the cavalry, is celebrated as the hero of Haifa. So it is not just the defense of Israel, but even the creation of Israel can be traced back to the soldiers from Bharat, to the cavalry from Bharat. And there's also an interesting aspect that this cavalry was not part of the British troops or the British Indian troops. These were part of the Indian states of Mysore, Jodhpur, and Baginagar as independent princely states who joined the Allied forces as equals. So they were not, even the argument that the Indians were fighting on behalf of the imperial force doesn't apply to this case, because these were part of the independent Indian forces of Jodhpur, Mysore, and Baginagar.
quite remarkable. The numbers that you've mentioned are staggering, almost 4 million, um, which is almost approaching the levels which were recorded with regard to holocausts and other crimes against humanity. So the death toll of Indian soldiers and indeed the wounded was extraordinary. If I recall you mentioning there were over 87,000 Indian soldiers who died in World War One and almost a similar figure, 74,000 or thereabouts in World War Two. That's 1.5 million Indian soldiers who died on the battlefronts in Europe and across North Africa. And yet it's a history which is untold.
Yep, as nearly 150,000 rather than 1.5 million. So 150,000 Indian soldiers
Yeah,
gave their life for freeing the Western theater, France, Belgium, Italy, and of course Indian soldiers who fought valorously in North Africa and Mesopotamia as well, right? So when you go to all of these war cemeteries across Europe, be it in France or in Belgium or in Italy or in Germany, you see the memorials for the Indian soldiers. So these countries have remembered the contributions of the Indian soldiers. And I remember speaking to a old World War II veteran who still travels across Europe going to these cemeteries. And he pointed out that there are so many cemeteries from France to Belgium to all the way to Malta that have a whole section for the Indian soldiers. But this is rarely discussed in the major conversations around World War, right? And it is at that point I realized that it is the fault of the Indian diaspora to have not taken ownership of this and make sure that at least we are aware of their contributions so that the next generation, so we can pass on that information to next generation, and also demand that the Indian soldier is remembered in the same way the European soldiers and the American soldiers and the Soviet soldiers and the Chinese and the Japanese soldiers who fought in those two wars, right? So we deserve as much a remembrance, our Indian soldiers deserve as much a remembrance and um, um, and praise like any other soldiers in the world, right? So this is the main core of Marigold mission to bring
wonderful.
justice for this particular cause.
Excellent. We, in our tradition, we have ceremonies whereby we acknowledge our ancestors, their deaths, and we do Darpan and Pitru Puja and so on. And it does occur to me that there are many, many soldiers who gave up their lives on the battlefields of Europe, and probably nobody has ever had the thought or the sentiment that we should host some sort of a Darpan ceremony whereby they too will receive that long overdue recognition. The mission you've explained. Now, would you like to just expand a little bit about the marigold? Because I know that the poppy has become synonymous with this Remembrance Day ceremony, procedure, ritual that has now become such a large part of the European consciousness. I often thought when I looked at poppies that they signified the red of the blood which was shed on those battlefields. And when you reflect upon the figures that you've just been talking about, a lot of that blood was Hindu Indian blood. And yet it's almost been appropriated, shall we say, by the story and the narrative that is told across Europe. So that's valid. So tell us a little bit more about the marigold aspect.
So yes, up until 2016, we didn't have a dedicated remembrance flower for the Indian soldiers. It was only the change of guard in 2013 when we had the new government in India, in Bharat, that the central government in India started showing any interest in promoting the the actual truth of the Indian soldiers who fought and died in the two world wars. As someone who was born in Bharat and went through education there and even my undergraduate degree over there, I did not know the contributions of the Indian soldiers in the two world wars, despite the fact that both wars were discussed in detail in our high school, right? Like you study about the assassination of Archduke and the circumstances that led to the First World War, and of course the entire the entire period of the First World War, and then what happens during the interwar period, and of course what caused the Second World War with the German invasion of Poland. So we studied all of this in detail. but nowhere in that syllabus is the fact that nearly 4 million Indian soldiers fought and died, and the pinnacle battles like the Battle of Somme or Battle of Haifa or Battle of Gallipoli or Battle of Monte Cassino, the places where Indian soldiers were so valorous was ever mentioned. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of the First World War is that the 89th Battalion, still today, 89th Punjabi Battalion, still remains the most deployed battalion in human history. So they fought on
Extraordinary.
9 different theaters, starting all the way from Ypres to Neuve-Chapelle in France, to Somme, to Emmen. They were sent everywhere. They fought valorously. Wherever there was a bottleneck, the 89th Battalion was sent. That's how successful these troops were. But somebody who went to school in India and studied history in Bharat, I wasn't aware of this fact. It is only in the last 10 to 15 years when you start reading, most often than not, Western historians, that you come across this fact. Go ahead, Panditji.
It's extraordinary because you've mentioned that there has been discrimination in the accounts, the telling of the history. But I recall once I started to research this that there is actually another phenomenon. Even during wartime, the Indian soldiers were discriminated against. They were segregated into different units. They had lower pay. And obviously, as you've just mentioned, globally, very, very little recognition for their pivotal contribution. In fact, we're having this conversation in English, and I'm sitting here in England. I often think that if it wasn't for the contribution and the sacrifice of the Indian soldiers, we may well be having this conversation in German.
Indeed. What's interesting is that in the Second World War, that change of guard and the change of attitude amongst the Indians in moving away from this sort of what you would call as at the end of the First World War, India had a massive opportunity to free herself, right? And that was pretty much dismantled by the Gandhian attitude of the day. So up until the Second World War, during the interwar period, not much progress were made in terms of really liberating Bharat. It's only when the Indian soldier, particularly those who joined the Indian National Army and the Azad Hind, would change the story and would change the narrative and would effectively liberate Bharat, right? And this is one of the reasons why both sides, to an extent, Britain, from its own point of view, would prefer to have had would have preferred to have this narrative that somehow liberating India was a very peaceful, diplomatic. We sat around a table, had some chai, and decided to part ways, rather than the reality that it was their loss of control of the Indian soldier who did not want to be treated as a second class citizen after having fought to liberate Europe. So the same thing happened in the First World War. So when the Indian soldiers came back after having fought to liberate Western Europe, they were treated as second-class citizens. And one of the biggest contributions came from the Sikh communities, right? So as I mentioned, the 89th Punjabi Regiment. So it is in Punjab, it is in Amritsar. You see this unrest, this feeling that after having fought and died for liberating the Western Europeans, now we are being treated as second-class citizens, and that ends up being the discontentment going on to the Rowlatt Act and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which I think undermined the British justification for the colonial rule. Once the Jallianwala Bagh happened in Punjab, the community that fought for liberating that fought significantly for liberating Europe alongside the Hindus felt that they no longer will put up with this. And at the end of the Second World War, we almost reached the same situation that prosecuting the Indian National Army was a bad strategic move. Instead of so Britain decided that it is going to prosecute those who fought along the fought as part of the Indian National Army and the Azad Hind forces under Subhash Chandra Bose. And in the famous trial, I think if I remember right, Jawaharlal Nehru, after being freed from prison, put on his barrister attire to go and defend the three soldiers of the Indian National Army, right? So there are so then elevates the national conversation, and the people of Bharat soon realized that the only way to gain independence is by the maxim that Subhash Chandra Bose proposed, which is "Give me blood and I'll give you freedom." And then, of course, we have the Indian naval mutiny, which then goes into Britain deciding that it can no longer um, enforce the same level of control it did in the Indian armed forces. And Britain and the entire Western Europe put together did not have the level of forces that they would need to, excuse me, to suppress any sort of um, large scale revolt against the empire. So that's when Britain decided that it'll leave India.
Mm.
Required money.
Yeah, there were a couple of aspects to what you've just said, which I also explored a little in detail, shall we say. And the first thing that I discovered was that the British government had a war debt to the Americans at the end of the First World War, which they reneged upon. And then there was a war debt to Bharat at the end of the Second World War, which they also reneged upon. But from what you're saying, there were agreements, shall we say, understandings that Bharat would be given its freedom. It would be liberated from the enslavement of the British Empire. And yet that too was reneged upon. That agreement was reneged upon. I recall Nehru going to Bretton Woods and actually petitioning for the settlement of the war debt and it being denied to him. He came back empty-handed. So this mission Marigold that we're referring to, I have a feeling it's going to help reset a lot of mistruths and untruths and perhaps even misinformation and disinformation about that whole period. But I'm definitely getting a feeling the biggest contribution that we can make is to recover the dignity and to recognize the courage of the indigenous soldiers that came from Bharat. And in Sarojini Naidu's words, in her incredible poem, shed their blood on Europe's fields in Flanders. I visited Ypres and spent a significant amount of time reflecting upon what that monument actually represents and reading the individual names of Bharatiya soldiers. And you're right, it is an account of history, which, unless it's memorialized adequately and taught across Indian schools, obviously, but in Britain as well, it can make an extraordinary contribution and help even perhaps reverse this sentiment of anti-Hindu, anti-Indian sentiment, which seems to be those flames seem to be being fanned at the moment as Britain undergoes its identity crisis. So you've mentioned mission, you've mentioned Marigold. So specifically, what is it that you're hoping to do? What steps are you going to be taking? And how can our viewers who are participating and whose participation we're grateful for today, but also the viewers who are going to be viewing this in subsequent broadcasts and streams, how can they participate to either find out more, but also to spread this knowledge and help reset what seems to me to be a very significant and major historical wrong?
Indeed. So, as part of Mission Marigold, we started this in 2020. At that point, there were less than about 20 people who were participating in what we wanted to achieve. As of today, we have over 10,000 people across three countries, Bharat, Britain, and United States, who are participating in different levels in promoting the knowledge about the contributions of the Indian soldiers and India in general towards the war efforts, right? So the first thing is to adapt Marigold as the flower of remembrance, as officially declared by the government of India and the United Services of India. So Marigold is the remembrance flower for the remembrance of Indian soldiers. Go ahead, Panditji.
So step one
Mhm,
is to have a much wider recognition
mhm.
that in the same way that the poppy is recognized throughout Europe, the marigold, the saffron marigold, which is an indigenous and flower and a symbol of Bharatiya courage, that should be also recognized in Bharat further, but also across Europe and in perhaps even over in the United States. So the recognition is step one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the number two is for the Indian diaspora living in Britain, in the wider Europe, and in United States to start participating in the Remembrance Sunday events across Britain and the Armistice Day in Europe and the Veterans Day in the United States. I believe the Armistice Day and the Veterans Day are on the 11th of November every year, whereas in Britain, the Remembrance Sunday is the Sunday closest to the Remembrance Day. So this year that will be the 9th of November. So every year that changes, but it's a Sunday that's closest to it. And if you search for Remembrance Sunday, you will find out what date it is exactly. And this year that falls on the 9th of Sunday to participate in their local remembrance events and ask the local authorities if it is okay for if they would be okay with us laying a wreath with poppies and marigolds embedded into it as part of the Remembrance Sunday. In our experience, having dealt with five different counties across southern England, almost everyone has welcomed that, and that we've never had once had anyone protesting it. So they're glad to have this Indian representation as part of the Remembrance Sunday. So now the onus is on us as the Indian diaspora to get involved. Number three is then to spread the information as we encourage parents to go into their schools and talk to the school administration and see whether they can do an assembly during the Remembrance Sunday week about the contributions of the Indian soldiers. So at least the next generation is aware of the great contributions. And of course, the other one is to encourage in at workplaces the conversation about the contributions of the Indian soldiers, and also having a box of marigolds and collect money and donate it to the various veteran charities that's across the United Kingdom. So three things. Accept Marigold as or elevate Marigold as the flower of remembrance of the Indian soldiers, not just of the First and the Second World War, but any war in general, so that it immediately invokes this our sense of gratitude to those who have lost their lives. So Marigold should evoke that sentiment right away. Then the second point is to participate in public events and make Marigold part of this bouquet of flowers that are used as remembrance flowers, because France has its own remembrance flower, Italy has its own, and of course Indian soldiers deserve to have their own remembrance flower in this wider conversation. And number three, spread as much information as possible through education, through schools, and through conversations with families and colleagues. We have a website called missionmarigold.org. You'll be able to find that if you Google for it, or we'll send it out as a newsletter. You will have all the information that you would need, detailed information with lots of photographs and um, lots of interesting information about various major milestones of the two world wars and how India had a huge impact on it. And over the course of next year, we'll add more content to it, and we'll also have more webinars and more presentations, so that we want to come to a situation that almost every county in England should recognize the contributions of the Indian soldiers, and we encourage parents of Indian origin to go and talk to the schools to have an assembly just for this, because the time has come for us to do the right thing. I think that is how we can remember those who sacrificed their lives for us.
That's a wonderful set of action points, which I think should be comfortably within the scope of anybody to be able to execute. I'm also reminded that August the 14th is the day before India's freedom and independence is celebrated. It's also a day when the souls who lost their lives in the independence struggle, they have a tadpan for them in Haridwar. And so I'll get in touch with the organizers of that. And I think we can have them support and get involved in the initiative as well. That'd be really quite wonderful. So you've mentioned missionmarigold.org. And for those who are regular visitors to our globalhindufederation.org website, we will also have a link to the website that Kumarji has just referred to. Now, you very kindly shared with me another dimension of this initiative, which I thought was also a wonderful dimension. And that dimension is the dimension of having some physical item, something which we could perhaps share with people so that they would remember and also wear with pride.
Mhm.
I'm going to show the item that you very kindly shared with me. I'm
Mhm.
going to pop it up here. And so this is actually an incredibly beautiful saffron marigold lapel badge. I have a poppy badge which is similar to this, but this is extraordinary. Tell me what you were thinking about doing with this particular badge. I think it's a wonderful initiative.
So we encourage people to wear their marigolds as a symbol of remembrance during the Remembrance Week, leading up to the Armistice Day on the 11th of November. For the last 4 years, we've been giving these marigolds out free of cost to anybody who is interested in wearing it as part of the Remembrance Week and Remembrance Sunday. I think we are going to be distributing a few marigolds through Global Hindu Federation. We've also done that through Insight UK, P Gurus, and few other organizations. There are a couple of healthcare associations of people of Indian origin are also going to be participating in it this year. So we'll have about 1,000 people wearing a marigold pin as a remembrance for the Indian soldiers who fought as part of the Allied forces.
Wonderful. So, as part of our GHF contribution, I think let's just make it quite clear. If anybody were to visit our website and register their interest in this particular initiative, then we will very happily send to them free of charge a saffron marigold, which they too can wear on that day. So, please, if you're watching, register and do let us know. And do share this video, do share the message, do share the websites and let as many people know as possible. Kumarji, do you have any closing remarks before we move to a quick Q&A session?
Indeed, just the point about us being aware of the contributions is where we should all start. Like how most students in India were denied this information or this truth about their own ancestors fighting to liberate Bharat. We should do all we can to fight against that. And the reason why that happened is because of who inherited the seats of power post independence. Post independence, we ended up with, given the fact that most of the revolutionaries have died fighting for Bharat, like Bhagat Singh and like Subhash Chandra Bose, we ended up with a set of leaders who did not view the sacrifices of the Indian soldiers on both sides, the Indian Army and the Indian National Army, as vital to the wider tapestry of Indian history. It is clearly obvious that without the contributions of the Indian soldier, neither would the world be free now, nor is the fact that we could have defended India after independence. Because right after independence, we had to face the illegal occupation and the invasion by our neighbors on the west, and we could only defend it because we had soldiers who fought valorously in the Second World War, who were willing to defend and die for the motherland. Right? So it is important on both accounts. Their sacrifices to liberate the world and their sacrifices to defend Bharat post Second World War, and minimizing their sacrifices and not focusing on their contributions in school books across India is a travesty. So that is one thing that we should argue to fix as much as we can. And those of us who live outside Bharat can work with the local authorities and local schools about how to inculcate the truth of what happened, right? And interestingly, it is easier to change the educational system in the West because they are more open to listening to our evidence than the situation we have in India, where changing a syllabus takes a lot more effort and a lot more political campaigning to get it done, right? So that is where I would start with.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Satyameva Jayate, let truth alone provide. Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, just recapping on that, there is a history to be retold. I've often, shall we say, mentioned that to call it India's independence is also a misnomer. It's not as though Bharat was dependent upon Britain. And so at some point in time, Britain very graciously said, okay, you're now mature enough and you can be released into the world as an independent nation capable of governing itself. That too is a complete fabrication of the reality and a denial of what Bharatiyas had to go through in order to acquire that freedom. But on an optimistic note, I can't help but accept that growing awareness and increased advocacy, we can shift narratives. And with a younger generation who are so proliferate, shall we say, prolific on X and platforms, we should be able to do something in a short space of time, as opposed to it taking as long as it ordinarily would. And reclaiming these historical narratives calls for global recognition of shared battles. It will foster unity. It will create a harmony. It will create a closeness at the grassroots level. How I have in my mind the vision of a bouquet. You mentioned that all of these European nations and Bharat have their own flowers of remembrance. A bouquet which captures all of those could really be a symbol of how our shared path against tyranny has actually got something to teach us even in this day and age. And those narratives which are seeking so clearly to divide, to use identity politics to create friction, to look at fault lines and to inflame those fault lines, we could go a long way towards reversing the harm that those narratives are doing. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. I'm going to now move over to a Q&A, and if we have people who would like to ask questions, they're welcome to do so. I'll be able to highlight them and bring them onto the stage. The Zoom facilities for showing hands to raise awareness and to be able to help spot where you are, they're available. So please, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I will bring you onto the panel to have a conversation. We're not going to take too long over this, 10 or 15 minutes at the absolute outset, and then we will call it a day. So Gopiji, thank you very much for raising your hand. Please do speak. We can hear you.
Namaste, everybody. Real quick question. What is the likelihood of A, raising funds for, and B, achieving the necessary political steps required to put a monument, a significant large monument in the UK, in England itself, to honor these soldiers, perhaps in the middle of some busy traffic circle, et cetera, et cetera. What are the thoughts about that, and what kind of funds would be required, and how do we raise those funds? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Balaji, before I hand over the mic to you, I have a little bit of experience in this. The statue to Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, which is now in Parliament Square, that's probably an example to consider. The cost of it was some £250,000. But that was a slightly different sort of an initiative. I think this sort of initiative would actually be very much more grassroots. And I think that the involvement and support of the government would also be a lot more forthcoming than it was in that particular case. The quality of our petition to the powers to be, I think, will really determine what will happen with that. I have had notice from the government's faith department and team that they are entertaining a proposal for a Muslim memorial for the contribution of Muslims in defending this country. And so they're very much open to this as a principle. Yeah, I'm more than happy to have our UK-based Global Hindu Federation put something together with Balaji's support and his organization, missionmarigold.org. And let's try it and move forward. The moral argument is there and the principle is established. So I suspect it's more to do with the quality with which and the determination with which we present this. We will reach out to our cousins. I noticed your American accent there. We will reach out to our cousins in the diaspora, especially those who are in the land of the brave and the free, to participate in this. The story needs to be told everywhere. The issues I raised at the outset where in the United Kingdom now there seems to be a subliminal tide coming in, that Hindus have no stake in this country, and that they should consider relocating and going back to where they came from. The sort of rhetoric we had in the 60s is now beginning to be heard again. And I think this initiative would help to push that back, and we could probably get a lot of buy-in from the persons on the ground. Balaji's statement that we should take this to schools, I think if we put onto that initiative the request for a memorial as well, then that'll help build further momentum. Balaji, do you have any thoughts on a memorial in the United Kingdom?
Indeed, let me add a couple of points on what the situation is in the United Kingdom and then what the right course of action is. Right. So well, we do have a memorial for Indian soldiers in the United Kingdom that is in Chatri in Brighton. The idea being the soldiers who fought in the Western Front, those who were wounded, were treated in Bournemouth and Brighton. So the memorial was then built in Brighton because of the fact that a lot of Indian soldiers eventually died in the Brighton Pavilion and in Bournemouth. So it made sense at that point to have the memorial in Chatri, and also the Victory Gate, the India Gate Memorial in India, where now Subhash Chandra Bose stands majestically. So the two dedicated memorials that were built by Britain were one in Chatri and one in New Delhi, the India Gate Memorial. But there is also an argument to have a dedicated memorial in the imperial capital in London for the Indian soldier, mainly because there is a dedicated monument for the American soldier, for the Canadian soldier, for the Australian and New Zealand corps in London. So they all have their own independent soldiers, and even the horses and the dogs have their own independent memorial in London, but not the Indian soldier. So they do have one for the collective Commonwealth, which they claim also includes India. But given the fact that more number of Indian soldiers fought as part of the Allied soldiers than rest of them put together, means that like New Zealand and Canada and Australia and South Africa put together did not contribute both in terms of money and in manpower and in ammunitions compared to any of the other states. Just to put it into perspective, I think if I remember the numbers right, 60 to 70% of the steel that was needed for conducting the war came from India. So what Britain intentionally deindustrialized India after 1857. But at the middle of the First World War, they realized that that was a big mistake. So they had to reverse the 40 years of deindustrialization that they've done, so that by the time we went into Second World War, India was the single largest contributor of steel that Britain required to build its ammunitions and artillery, right? So it is, on one hand, we gave the manpower to fight these wars, and on the other, we gave them money and the materials to conduct the war. There is an interesting report that says, effectively ends by saying that the conclusion that we come that we come to based on what we have looked at is that Britain could have neither defended herself and expanded her territories at the end of the First World War, and would have survived the Second World War without the Indian troops. That is how they themselves conclude, by saying that without having India as an ally in the First and the Second World War, Britain could have lost drastically, right? And it is that that backpedaling in after the end of the First World War and part of the beginning of the Second World War that put Britain in the back foot. That is why they did realize in 1946 that they no longer had the sort of control that they had on the Indian Army. So that meant that the occupation of Bharat has ended, right? So at the middle of the Indian naval revolt, Britain decides to leave India. So that is why we got freedom, not because Mohandas Karamchand fasted for a few days. That had almost no impact whatsoever. Every major historical figure of the time has noted this fact. From Clement Attlee to Ambedkar. Ambedkar, when asked by BBC, how much impact do you think? So he was asked the question, what do you think is the reason why Britain had to leave India? His straightforward answer was Britain no longer had the loyalty of the Indian soldier because of the way the Indians were treated at the end of the Second World War. That's point number one. Point number two, BBC asked how much influence did Mohandas Karamchand had on Britain's decision to leave India. And Ambedkar thinks for a while and he says very little, if at all, anything. Right. So that is the truth. That is the truth. India is free because of the Indian Army and the Indian National Army, not because of the pointless satyagrahas and endless fastings that had no impact in the larger scheme of things.
So,
Mm.
just coming to a conclusion, Gopiji, thank you for that question. Just coming to the conclusion, it's
Mm.
almost as though a family of nations came together to fight the scourge and the menace of the Nazi war machine in World War II. And then, if all family members had sort of sold off their family assets, their resources, and everything else, and then sent individuals to fight in this war, and they managed to complete the war successfully and attain victory. And then, as though one very large family member who contributed an awful lot and whose household contributed bodies as well as steel is then written out of history. It's far too consistent for it to be an accident of history. And so I think this is a story that is really desperately needed, and it's something that we have to share and tell. Balaji, thank you so much for the research that you have done, for the initiative of putting Mission Marigold together. And I'm absolutely delighted that our GHF team is going to be working with you on making sure that we retell this. I would love to think that at some time in the near future, maybe even Ypres next year, we could hold an appropriate Darpan ceremony and to acknowledge those Jivatmas who have never had the ceremony performed in their name. I think that would be a really wonderful initiative. Let's see whether we can help to make that happen as well. Gopiji, thank you for your point about fundraising. Eminently necessary. And I think once we start the ball rolling, momentum will start to pick up. And we have enough people who would make this happen. The narrative is something that we have to really get clarified. Stephen, thank you for your question. The recording will be made available. It's a pleasure to connect with you after all these years of being apart and being very busy in our respective areas of work. But yes, we will make the recording available. We do have a request, and that request is that as soon as is possible, can we post this so that other people can share it? It'll go out on a GHF newsletter as well. And we would ask everybody, please do tell this story, share this work, join us in this Mission Marigold, and let's look forward to bringing our families together in a shared success, one which we can celebrate and one which will resound and set an example for other initiatives together. Balaji, any closing remarks?
Yes, just one point that we are at the right juncture in time, given that Britain wants this close relationship with Bharat, and the way that the British look at it and the way that we look at it is that Britain in the West and Bharat in the East can set examples on how to form a productive relationship and how to move the conversations ahead, because we are entering into very tumultuous times. So the world is going to need a lot of handholding and a lot of guidance, and I believe Bharat can provide that. So this is the right time to honor the sacrifices of our ancestors who fought for the liberation of the world. So on that note, Jai Hind and Satyameva Jayate.
Balaji, thank you so much for that. We often say to people that trade is downstream of politics, and politics is downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of dharma. So we have a lot to contribute in this space, and I'm looking forward to having another outing with you. Balaji, thank you so much. Jai Shri Ram to everybody. Jai Hind, and have a wonderful day. Jai Ma Bharati.